Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Jeff Ranson. I'm a senior associate with the Canada Green Building Council, and I'd like to welcome you all here to our Lunch and Learn that's looking at the impacts of COVID on the practice of benchmarking and a variety of different benchmarking programs in Canada and specifically in the Ontario market. And this is part of a larger project to support the advancement of benchmarking and disclosure that the Canada Green Building Council has been involved in. I'd just like to take a minute to acknowledge the support of the Atmospheric Fund in funding this program, as well as a series of workshops that we've been delivering over the last 3 years around Energy Star training for Ontario's energy, water reporting and benchmarking regulation. And the ability to do this research obviously is really important to help understand, the practice of benchmarking and how we continue to accelerate this really important activity, even in challenging times. A little bit of housekeeping for us. It's going to be a big audience. We certainly would like your questions throughout. We're going to ask that people use the chat function for questions. We'll have some time at the end, hopefully, to pull questions out of there and ask them. We'll get to as many questions as possible. If you would like, we may not be able to get to all of them. I encourage people to put their email address in their questions. If we don't get to them, we'll try to respond to some questions by email after the event. But we will be screening that and try to answer as many questions as possible. So I'd like to introduce our speakers now for today's session. Eric Chisholm and Matthew Hirsch, both principals with Purpose Building, and Purpose has been supporting us on this EWRB project since the beginning. So we really appreciate their support and their work in compiling today's information. And I'm going to turn it over to them. Thanks, Matthew and Eric.
Thanks very much, Jeff. And thank you everyone for joining our session today. Both Eric and I are delighted to have this opportunity to speak with all of you on how COVID impacts building performance benchmarking and reporting. Briefly, our agenda for the next hour. We have a really diverse audience today, as Jeff mentioned, over 200 people registered to join. So I'll just start with a little bit of context and background on why we're thinking about the impact of COVID on benchmarking reporting and sort of the process that we've worked with the CAGC and other stakeholders on over the last couple of months. Then we'll highlight some key messages around benchmarking and reporting pandemic impacted performance. We'll give an overview of some of the pandemic related guidance that's been published by common benchmarking and reporting programs that are used. And then we'll present a number of sort of go forward recommendations focused on building owners and managers, leaders of benchmarking and reporting programs, and industry organizations and advocacy groups. And we'll circle back on a couple of conclusions and key takeaways from today's session. So to begin, I mentioned that our audience is very diverse today. And that speaks to the fact that benchmarking building performance is really a fundamental aspect of effective building and portfolio management. And just for clarity, when we're talking about building performance today, what we're referring to specifically is energy and water efficiency of a building. At a high level, benchmarking and reporting utility consumption is one of the core tools that we as an industry have to evaluate how our buildings compare to one another. It allows us to measure and receive recognition for our efforts to reduce consumption and to improve performance over time. And as an industry, we benchmark performance for a lot of different reasons. Many of you on the call today are probably preparing for annual regulatory compliance reporting for Ontario's EWRB policy. There's voluntary reporting programs that are intended to engage and inspire the market, like Race to Reduce and the Climatewise Buildings Challenge, RealPAC's normalization program, the Disclosure Challenge. We also report performance for certification purposes. LEED, BOMA Best, Energy Star certification are a few examples. And then we benchmark performance for internal purposes, that sort of day-to-day work of monitoring, managing, and evaluating the performance of the buildings that we work in to identify opportunities to get better. So for each one of these benchmarking and reporting activities, as an industry, generally we're pretty comfortable and familiar with the process. We know the tools, we understand how they work, we know how to get the data that we need. We have a good sense of what our benchmarking results mean and how to use them. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted a lot of things, but specifically for our industry, how buildings are used and how they are operated has been different over the last 15 months than before the pandemic. And I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know. We've lived this process together over the last 15 months, but as a result of those changes, the typical processes, those well-honed approaches that we've established for how we measure and manage and evaluate the performance of our buildings has been disrupted too. So this disruption presents a challenge. It's raised a lot of questions. You're likely on this call because you've encountered one of these kinds of questions in your work as you're trying to benchmark or report or interpret pandemic impacted building data. And these are the kinds of questions that folks who lead benchmarking and reporting programs that we all participate in and contribute to, we're getting sort of at the start of the pandemic and through the pandemic from their clients and participants in these programs. How do I look at this year's data, my pandemic impacted data, as compared to previous years? Is my building still eligible for certification? Those are the kinds of questions that have been raised. And so recognizing this uncertainty in the market, as Jeff sort of gave an overview at the outset, the Canada Green Building Council convened sort of this particular project with the goal of empowering building owners, managers, and operators with the information that they need to continue benchmarking, continue reporting, and ultimately continuing to improve building performance in spite of the challenges that are presented by the pandemic. And recognizing that, as I said off the top, as an industry, we benchmark for lots of different reasons and participate in many different kinds of benchmarking and reporting programs. A coordinated effort was going to be needed to sort of bring some key messages to market. So in mid-February, the Canada Green Building Council hosted a workshop discussion that brought together leaders from 9 different benchmarking and reporting initiatives. The 9 shown on the screen here. And the focus of that discussion was really to explore, what are the challenges when benchmarking and reporting COVID impacted data? What are some of the approaches, the solutions, and the ideas that sort of each individual benchmarking program and reporting platform is using to respond to those challenges? And then explore together where are the opportunities to build alignment around some key messages that we can take back to the industry as a whole. And so through that workshop and subsequent discussions with these key program leads and other industry stakeholders, we've arrived at alignment on 3 key messages and a set of 17 recommendations for benchmarking and reporting pandemic impacted building performance data. And so that's really what we're going to spend the majority of today on, and we're really excited to have this opportunity to sort of share all of that with you. So with that context in mind, I'll pass things on to Eric to dive into the key messages piece.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Really appreciate it. And everyone, thanks for joining today. The key messages, I think, is the beginning of what can we all agree on in the marketplace. And that's a challenging thing to think about, because we're actually all bringing different perspectives and different programs and different math to the equation. And with that in mind, there were three big outcomes that were concluded by the group that gathered. And these are them. First of all, not a surprise, pandemic period operation has changed building performance. Buildings aren't performing the way they were beforehand. Second of all is, despite this, benchmarking is valuable now more than ever. And thirdly, that although there are challenges to the process of benchmarking right now, these are generally seen to be surmountable despite being challenging. So to dive in on each of those messages, we'll flip to the next slide and talk about the first of them. How has pandemic period operation changed building performance? Not surprisingly, it looks different in different types of buildings. When schools shut down completely, energy use changes drastically. When retail shuts down completely and hotels shut down completely, we see significant changes in performance. Office buildings are not shutting down completely. And for that reason, performance from a benchmark perspective is not as well correlated with closure or pandemic period operation. So for example, an office building that is expected to be usable, even if one out of the 100 or 1,000 usual occupants are in the space, if only one occupant is in the space, there is a minimum level of comfort and requirement that is still needed in that space. And so we're seeing different trends for office buildings. And finally, for multi-unit residential buildings, performance is varying in many ways. Some multi-res buildings are occupied more often than they ever have been before, for more hours and with more people than they ever have before, because people aren't out of the house, they're in the house. Other multi-unit residential buildings are seeing significant vacancies due to migrations in where people are able to or choosing to spend their time. So pandemic period operation has been changing building performance, but not in any single way. It has been different for each asset class. Jumping to the next core outcome of the group discussion is that sorry, this is still on the first one. We talked a little bit about reasons for operating practice fragmenting within asset classes, shutting down versus leaving buildings on. The other thing that I didn't mention before is that there are differences in how buildings are choosing to operate, or building owners are choosing to operate. So there have been some industry recommendations saying, bring in as much outdoor air as you can all the time, change your filtration, go to this type of filter, turn off your heat recovery ventilators, do all of these things. Some owners are doing it and some aren't, partly because the guidance remains unclear. But what that means is that we're seeing differences in how buildings are performing from an energy perspective as well. That the key takeaway there is that When we are looking at a data set for benchmarking, we are no longer looking at one data set. We used to be in a world where we could take 100 different office buildings and compare them all to the same yardstick and say this one's doing better and this one's doing worse. Because generally we have come to an agreement on what an acceptable level of quality is in an office building. We no longer have agreement on what an acceptable level of quality is from an air delivery perspective or system performance perspective. And for that reason, we don't have one benchmark anymore. We need to compare the buildings that are operating as they were, and we shouldn't be comparing those to the buildings that are operating in new ways and changing the quality that they are delivering to occupants. Jumping forward. So the second key takeaway is that benchmarking is valuable now more than ever. Why did we come to that conclusion as a group? At its core, benchmarking is about answering questions that inform action. Is my building performance getting better? Why is it changing? Am I a good performer or a bad one? These questions are still important today, even during pandemic-impacted operations. And perhaps even more important today when there is such a focus on operating costs, particularly when revenue streams aren't what they were previously from a stability perspective. So benchmarking is definitely remaining a valuable exercise, and perhaps even more so than previously. Next slide. Some additional reasons to benchmark have emerged. Maintaining occupant trust is one that we are hearing feedback from the marketplace on. That in this time when buildings are generally shutting down, and sorry, not buildings generally shutting down, but when organizations are needing to work remotely, and revenue streams are in some cases fluctuating or uncertain or decreasing, there is an expectation, there's an occupant desire to see that operating costs are coming down if possible. And benchmarking is one way to demonstrate that there is responsible operation activity happening. And then second of all is understanding how buildings perform under unfamiliar conditions. This isn't an occupant perspective thing. This is going to draw new insights on how we build buildings in the future and new insights on how we operate buildings in the future. But we don't have the data yet. We are just at the tipping point of starting to be able to collect that data now that we have just over 12 months of pandemic period operation to look at. Jumping ahead. Finally, pandemic period benchmarking challenges definitely exist. They are surmountable. This was a very interesting discussion and realization, is that the key challenges today, with COVID in mind, from a benchmarking perspective, the key challenges are actually the same challenges we had before, but we're noticing them more, and we're noticing them in different ways. So our entire industry has always had challenges accessing complete utility data. Our industry has always had challenges documenting accurate occupancy data. When are people in the building? How many? And the industry has always had challenges from interpreting results, because there are so many ways to interpret complex data in valuable ways. So these things haven't gone away. They haven't just emerged during the pandemic period. They remain, but the way that we think about them is changing. And we'll dive into that a little bit more when we get to the recommendations. Next slide. So I think this is going back over to Matthew to talk through some program-specific guidance.
Thanks, Eric. And so, as Eric described, we have general alignment around these key messages, core ideas, but several benchmarking and reporting programs that we worked through this process have also developed program-specific guidance that reflects the unique needs and methodologies of their individual programs. So we wanted to briefly highlight a few of the key changes implemented by these programs for properties that are benchmarking and reporting their pandemic impacted data. So we'll run through the programs. So for participants in the Climatewise Building Challenge, this is for York Region, that program is continuing as usual, but will focus in 2020 more on qualitative awards rather than quantitative performance metrics, and really work with participants to make sure that they're gathering and updating those building operational details, such as occupancy and operating hours that Eric spoke a little bit about, so that they can facilitate effective benchmarking of their COVID impacted data. Again, accelerating the process of benchmarking so that you can understand your buildings through this COVID period. And similarly, the City of Toronto's Greenwill initiative is also continuing as usual. Their focus will be sort of encouraging and continuing to reinforce the value of benchmarking during this COVID impacted operations period, and with a particular focus on the idea of having curiosity as you look at the benchmarking results for your building and explore the impact of atypical operating conditions on building performance. Natural Resources Canada's Energy Star program, Energy Star certification program for buildings, that program is continuing. NRCan has provided detailed guidance on their website regarding eligibility for certification. Those eligibility requirements mostly relate to, has your building experienced a prolonged closure during the 12-month annual reporting period that's used for this certification. And NRCan has also provided some additional flexibility in terms of the verification site visits. So the on-site checks that are typically required for this certification, there's some added flexibility in their process for that because of the limitations of the pandemic. So if you have a building that is pursuing an Energy Star certification, I'd encourage you to have a look at the detailed guidance that's available from NRCan around eligibility. The BOMA BEST program will be adjusting the way that performance is assessed for office buildings. New questions will be added to the office building assessment questionnaire beginning on June 15th. And the focus of those new questions is on encouraging building operations and management teams to engage in ongoing and active review of their operations in order to optimize sort of how the building is performing during this pandemic period, and to support occupant health and safety considerations. BOMA does have a series of webinars coming up that will dive into their program updates in more detail. Again, details on that you'll be able to find on BOMA Canada's website. RealPAC will be releasing an updated version of its energy and water normalization methodologies later on in Q2 of this year. Those updated methodologies reflect or have been updated to reflect the current best practices for energy and water use. And the methodologies improve the normalization for a couple of things particularly relevant during this pandemic period. The normalization methodology has been improved for fully leased buildings that have a low occupant density, which we've seen in a number of sort of office building context in particular. And there'll be improved handling of exceptional uses in this new methodology. So how to deal with spaces that have really high energy use or water use. And then also sort of better treatment of leased versus unleased or vacant spaces in buildings. So that new methodology will be released soon by RealPAC. The Canada Green Building Council has published guidance for COVID impacted buildings that are pursuing LEED for operations and maintenance certification. That guidance provides a couple of alternative pathways for projects that are applying for certification. Though these allowances or alternative pathways are available for projects that are applying for certification before June 30th of this year. So within that guidance, there's a sort of an allowance pathway for using pre-COVID performance data for the certification. And there's an alternate pathway that allows building teams to account for the impact of COVID, so reduced occupancy, adjusted operating hours as part of their application for certification. And then finally, the Canada Green Building Council's Disclosure Challenge. This program is continuing to gather data from participants and then sort of planning to pursue an investigation of COVID impacts in fall of this year. You know, really looking at that full year of pandemic impacted building performance data. Interestingly, if you're not currently participating in the Disclosure Challenge, but have an interest in this and sharing data with the Canada Green Building Council for this COVID impacts exercise, I'd encourage you to have a look at their website and then you know, feel free to reach out to the CAGC directly. So we'll move on to some sort of core recommendations that the working group had around pandemic period benchmarking and reporting.
Thanks very much, Matthew. The tag teaming is working well. So just as a time check for everyone, we're at 30 minutes past the hour. The hope is, if I can get my act together, that I'll get through these 17 recommendations in 10 minutes, which will leave 20 minutes for question and answer at the end. So if you haven't yet had a chance to start thinking about what questions you have, start thinking about those now, and 10 minutes from now, you will have your chance. All right, let's dive in on recommendations. First of all, these recommendations, Matthew, if you can flip forward, thank you. Appreciate it. So it comes down to, we thought, not everyone cares about everything. And some of us want to know different types of things and need to take action in different types of ways. And so we have looked at, and the group who met discussed and identified recommendations for 4 key areas of consideration. First of all, building owner day-to-day practices. So operations, maintenance, property management, etc. Second of all, strategic practices for building owners. So what does this tell me about what I should be doing in the future? Third of all, benchmarking platforms and reporting programs. And fourthly, industry organizations and advocacy groups. So we'll jump into the first one of those, building owner day-to-day practices. Recommendation number 1, continue or accelerate benchmarking. Don't stop. Now is not the time to stop. Now is the time to double down because things are changing. They're changing fast and we need to understand how and why. Item number 2, refer to program-specific COVID guidance. Matthew talked through all of the guidance that has been shared by the participating industry groups today. Recognize that that guidance is temporary because things are changing. They're changing very fast. Guidance might change tomorrow, but what it is now, and you've got it. Thirdly, know which pandemic response strategies your building has in place. Is your building keeping on as you always have from a ventilation perspective, from a humidity perspective, from a filtration perspective? Have you made changes? What are the changes? Why does this matter? Because at some point, someone's going to be asking, and probably someone's going to start looking at how that has affected your energy benchmarking performance. Next one, establish a standard process to gather occupancy data. Historically, there has generally been industry ability to make educated guesses about the number of people who are in the building any given hour of the day and frequency throughout the year. But that's changing day to day. It's changing week to week. It's changing month to month right now. Now is the time to start tracking that so that you have information to look back on and compare to your benchmarking performance. Next, consider using regional defaults to fill short-term occupancy gaps. So one of the conversations that came up was, what if we don't have any way to keep track of whether there's 10 people or 100 people or 1,000 people in the building right now? We know it's 1,000 people at full capacity. Could we use regional defaults? We're in the green zone, we're in the red zone, we're in the orange zone. Let's take a guess that means that this % of our population in there is in the building. It's not certain, it's not accurate, but it's better than absolutely nothing. So it's a place to start and think about. Finally, and this one was a real struggle, delaying measurement and verification activities until post-pandemic operation returns to normal, or stipulating values in the interim. So many of us are needing to measure and report back on our performance versus previous years, and are in the role of saying, I got 3% better, I got 5% worse. What is the number? What does that mean? Maybe monetarily. We are in too great a period of uncertainty right now to be able to compare this year to last year. There is no mathematical adjustment that anyone has high level of certainty in could allow pandemic operation to be compared to pre-pandemic operation. There are guesses, there are opinions, there isn't consistency in that. So if there are firm measurement and verification requirements that you have on your plate, think about how to respond to that, knowing that there isn't certainty available in the market right now. Jumping ahead to more strategic practices, looking ahead, what does this tell us about how we own, operate, manage, maintain, build buildings in the future? So the first one is when we are using our 2020, 2021 benchmarking data, make sure that we are looking at that with eyes open about whether this was a building that increased ventilation rates, whether this was a building that shut down completely. Without that information, 2020, 2021 data is going to be completely meaningless from a benchmarking perspective. Second of all, look for outliers in benchmarking results. If you have a portfolio of many buildings and most of them go in one direction and another goes in another direction, look for the reason why. It might be because of an operational item, but it might also because of a design strategy to think about for the future. Thirdly, evaluating operational adaptability, which, I'm not sure if anyone trademarked it, but hey, there you go. Now all 126 people in the room have it trademarked. There is an awareness that is increasing that some buildings are able to turn off or turn down better than others. Think about the example where you've got one light switch per floor in a building versus an occupancy sensor in every room. Is your building able to turn off completely when almost nobody's there? Or does it still have to run majority of its systems? We're discovering that a lot of buildings out there still have to run a majority of their systems, even if there's only one person in the building. And using that as inspiration for future design and future operation planning is probably going to yield benefits both now and following pandemic period operation. Next is evaluating the impact of tenant-landlord cooperation regarding space requirements and lease agreements. One of the reasons that buildings aren't shutting down systems completely, even when there's almost nobody in the building, is the lease says you got to provide and you provide. That makes absolute sense. If there is a tenant-landlord cooperation saying, I get it, it's a pandemic, I know the lease says this, but I'm okay with you doing that, that is a relationship that is going to yield value. So look for it and see where it gets you. Anticipate a near future when each property's performance is going to be compared against that of peers, and that's pandemic period performance. Not necessarily true that everybody's going to be asking for it, everybody's going to be measuring it, but definitely some will. Be aware that it'll show up and be ready for it when it does. And finally, consider benchmarking a specific non-calendar year 12 consecutive months. April 2020 is when we are seeing the most, this is a weird word to use, the most stable pandemic period benchmarking data set begin. And so if you are trying to figure out specifically what your pandemic period benchmarking looks like, look at an April 2020 to March 2021 period, as opposed to a calendar year 2020. Recommendations for benchmarking platforms and reporting programs. First of all, collecting data on how many buildings in the market are taking pandemic response operation actions, things like increasing ventilation, turning off heat recovery systems, and using that to align with the benchmarking data that you're collecting. Second of all, building standard processes for measuring and reporting building occupancy. Again, this connects to the building level recommendations, but now at the benchmarking platform level to being ready to start accepting that increased building occupancy data. And thirdly, continuing to validate processes for fairly comparing and scoring buildings. So, recognizing that all of the scores that we concluded pre-pandemic, what does 100, what does an A+ mean for building benchmarking. Those scores, in some ways, don't make sense during the pandemic period. And looking back on those and saying, how do I provide useful insight and recognition opportunities to properties participating in the benchmarking program is very important. Finally, industry organizations and advocacy groups. Two key recommendations here. First of all, establishing a set of updated building operation practices based on insights from COVID period performance data. We don't know, we don't have industry agreement on how much of an impact shutting off our heat recovery systems has, which is a recommendation of ASHRAE. We don't have industry accepted measurement of how much of an impact increasing ventilation rates has. We have opinions. If we come together and establish agreed upon best practices and the impacts on benchmarking, we will all be better for it. Second of all, using this as an opportunity to advocate for improved utility data sharing processes. Green Button is one example that has been in discussion for it's 5 or 10 years, I guess. But the idea that if we have easier access to our utility data, it will be easier to benchmark, faster, and more consistent. So I think I took up too much time, but there they are. There's the recommendations. Matthew, where are we off to next?
So we'll just sort of reshare the core conclusions, the key messages that we'd like to leave the group with, and then we'll have some moderated questions by Jeff and the CAGC team. So as Eric said again, feel free to add your questions to the chat function. And as Jeff mentioned at the beginning, we may not have the opportunity to get to all of them. We'll address as many of them as we can, but please do include your email address when you send in the questions so that we can respond offline. And so just again, reiterating sort of those core messages, the takeaways that we'd like to leave everyone with. Again, pandemic period, it has been very unique, and it has changed the way that we have needed to use buildings and that we've been operating buildings. But because of that, benchmarking is more valuable now than ever, and we can use this opportunity to be curious about our buildings, to understand them better, and to take opportunities to learn from them and translate that into improvements in how we operate, manage, and really design buildings as well. And yes, absolutely, Eric has flagged a number of the pandemic period benchmarking challenges that exist. But as he discussed, these are challenges that we've had sort of generally for the benchmarking process, and we have found solutions to overcome those. And we are already seeing sort of innovative solutions come through. I spoke with a building manager the other day on this occupancy question, and they're exploring putting in an occupancy counting system so that they can not